All right, what's up, beautiful people? This week I have Ajay Dave. He is a somatic therapist on the podcast. We talk about how to get into your body, how to leverage the intelligence of your body. This has been an awesome podcast. And if you have been enjoying the podcast, please leave a comment. Please share it with a friend. Like the channel. Do whatever you need to help me with the algorithms. And let's jump into the podcast. All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Silicon Valley to Spirituality show. I have an awesome guest, Ajay Dave. He is a somatic therapist. We are going to get into a lot of interesting topics today. But before we jump in, Ajay, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate being here and looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know what somatic means. I know what therapist means, but somatic therapist, for our listeners that might not be familiar with those two terms put together, could you give a brief background and explanation of what a somatic therapist is and what you actually do as a somatic therapist?
Yeah, basically, a somatic therapist uses the body in therapy. I guess that could be like a very basic explanation. And there's so many different ways the body can be used. So just like there are all different types of therapies and therapists, there are lots of different types of somatic therapies. For myself, the two main approaches I use, one is called Hakomi and the other is called integral somatic psychology. And I would say they both focus on being with our experience in the here and now. And so it involves the body and noticing where emotions are in the body, but could also involve noticing thoughts, impulses, movement, other kind of present moment experiences.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for that delineation. Now, I always like to know people's origin stories of how they got
Yeah.
into this. Were you always a somatic therapist, or did you have a previous life working in tech or doing into this? Can you give us a little bit of that background?
Yeah. Totally, totally. Yeah, I was drawn to your podcast because it's literally my journey, right? From Silicon Valley to spirituality. I went to did my undergrad at MIT and was very much into tech. And I would say my origination of kind of the path I'm on now actually occurred back then because I got a repetitive stress injury issue. And I tried for quite some time to try to heal myself because it was very difficult. I was needing to get lots of accommodations. Whenever I typed or wrote for a short amount of time, I would start to get pain in my body. And it was just very emotionally distressing. Like, I didn't know what my future looked like. How was I going to be like a software developer if I couldn't write or type? And I had a inspiration one evening that there must be like some solution to this. Like, I just had some knowing inside that there must be some answer or solution to this issue I was facing, and that was quite a problem. And I somehow stumbled upon the website conquerrsi.com. Unfortunately, it doesn't exist anymore unless someone has taken that domain name. But it basically talked about this approach by Dr. John Sarno called the mind body connection or mind body medicine. And to really simplify it, it's this idea that uh, if we have repressed emotions or emotions we haven't fully dealt with or processed with, the way that can sometimes be expressed is through chronic physical pain syndromes, such as repetitive stress injury. And of course, you always want to make sure that there's no obvious medical issue going on. But at this point, my dad's a doctor. I checked with the doctor at MIT. So I'd already gotten the basics checked out that there wasn't any known serious medical issue. And so with this approach, I did some journaling, some contemplation. I started to slowly re-engage in the physical activities. And I'm kind of leaving a lot of detail out, but basically in 2 weeks, I was like completely cured. I was able to play video games again. I was able to type again. Didn't need the accommodations. It was quite a magnificent experience, I would say. So that kind of implanted in me just this idea of the value of looking at emotions, the connection between the mind and the body. And I had other health issues that kind of fit into this broader mind body medicine approach. And Dr. Sarno mentioned in one of his books that like meditation or therapy could be useful for people for who his approach didn't necessarily cure their issues. So I thought, oh, this worked for me for RSI, but it's maybe not working for a stomach issue or for some allergies. So maybe there's a way I can, maybe I don't need to go a little bit deeper. So that was really the seed planting. Now, after MIT, I worked at Oracle in the San Francisco Bay Area for probably 7 years. And there I had my own journey where I got into yoga and meditation. I started seeing my own therapist. And slowly but surely that began to change me with this original seed that had been planted back in college. And for me, I think I was no longer finding my work at Oracle satisfying. And I was looking for work that would be satisfying, that would be nourishing. And I couldn't quite find it. Like I applied to some different places, I talked with different people, but nothing quite clicked until I had a conversation with two friends. And one of them just reflected back to me, it sounds like you just want to leave your job and take time off. And being a second generation immigrant, that idea had never really occurred to me. Like that just seemed irresponsible. It just wasn't even in my ballpark. But when she said it, it felt so true. And I had a real look at like my finances and what was really possible. And it was totally possible for me to take time off. And so around the end of 2014 is when I quit my job at Oracle and took some time off. And in that time, I did different things like volunteering with kids. I checked out a therapy training. And I actually thought I was going to be a child therapist. So when I went to grad school in like 2016, it was with the intention of becoming a child therapist. Anyway, I know I've been going on for a while, so I wanted to maybe pause there. And
Yeah, so it sounded like in college you noticed that you had some ailments, and in order to be a software engineer doing these repetitive strokes, if this was not solved, it would be very difficult to be an engineer. So you were able to
yeah,
find some sort of practice. I can't remember the website, but it had RSI in it.
yeah.
Within 2 weeks, you're cured of this, so you could go back to programming. Then you started
Yeah, yeah,
working at Oracle for, I believe, 7 years, you said. And after 7 years, you realize, hey, maybe this isn't for me. And I'm a first generation immigrant, but same kind of mentality, like taking a break
yeah,
was not on the table, or at least it was implied that it
yeah,
wasn't on the table. No one explicitly, I don't think, ever told me that. But in my mind, it was
yeah,
like,
yeah.
yeah, you get 2 weeks off a year and that's it. And so you explored a bunch of different things and started realizing that there might be life after software engineering. Now, outside of like the repetitive kind of injury that you had before, was there like a clear delineating moment of, okay, hey, I'm going to become a somatic therapist? Maybe it was a plant medicine
Right.
journey, maybe it was seeing a friend burn out and helping them. Is there an
Yeah.
event like that for you?
I don't think so. It was more gradual. There were definitely moments that really stood out. Like in 2000, I think it was 8 or 9, I went to my first multi-day Vipassana meditation retreat. And a lot of the retreat, I was really struggling. I had a lot of allergies. It was really uncomfortable. You're in this like quiet meditation environment that you're like sniffling. At least for me, I felt like super self conscious and was super congested. And but I stayed with the practices, and at the end of the retreat, I felt this overwhelming sense of compassion that I had never felt before. And remember just, like, enjoying my coworkers at Oracle after that for at least a couple of days in a way I hadn't before. And I remember the phrase I told myself, "What a lie." Like, here I've been living my life thinking I need to get these external things. And just by being present for a couple of days, I was experiencing this tremendous being. Now, I was naive back then. I thought, "Okay, cool. I'll just be present in my life and I'll feel like this all the time." It ended up not being not quite that simple, but that definitely was a significant moment, I would say.
Yeah.
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 What it sounded like to me was, like many people, a lot of your self-worth and value came from achieving external things. Through this Vipassana, you started realizing that this feeling of joy, purpose, and fulfillment could be generated from the inside out. So there was like a light bulb moment in your head that, oh, wow, like a lot of the previous framework was looking at external things to change my inner state.
Yeah.
Now it was more about, wow, I have some sovereignty over my inner state and I no
Mm.
longer have to chase these external things. So, how long was it before you had this realization to you deciding to become a somatic therapist?
Yeah, so it's like there were different steps in the journey. Like in 2011, I went to a month-long meditation retreat, and it was like I remember for a lot of days of that retreat just noticing how I felt deeply unsatisfied with the life I was living.
Mm,
And I think then I just didn't have the capacity or the courage or something to make the change then. However, what I did do, and it was like a first step, is I moved from like the Redwood Shores, Redwood City area in the peninsula to closer to Berkeley, California. And for people that don't know the San Francisco Bay Area, basically I moved to an area where there would be more meditation events, dance events, spiritual events. So and then I started working from home a bit too. So there was this kind of separation from work started to happen. And that actually happened. It took me a while to figure out that was the next step. That was in 2012. And then the step after that was quitting my job in 2014. And then, like I said, in 2016, I was starting grad school. I thought I was going to work with kids. And I was in a place by 2020 of both working with kids and adults. And then with the pandemic and everything being virtual, I went back to my somatic roots because I had benefited so much from somatic therapy starting probably in 2010.
got it.
So it was like this gradual process where really for some time I really thought I was going to be a child therapist, like 2016, 2017. But then I was like a beginning learning therapist. You're wanting to explore with different populations, different types of therapy, see what works for you. And somehow that led me back to my somatic roots.
Mm, that's so cool.
And I think there was also like a confidence factor too. I think I had something in me that was like, oh, I'm good enough to work with kids, but I'm not good enough to work with people my age or people older or adults with real life issues or something like that. Which is a funny way to think about it because in many ways, child therapy is actually harder than adult therapy. There's more to navigate and you're having to, it's like a cross cultural therapy.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that was like my path into somatic therapy.
Yeah, a few things. I definitely agree with you that being a child therapist is much more difficult. They don't have the vocabulary and ability to articulate what they're feeling, or sometimes they don't even know what they're feeling. And I often thought about like how
Yeah.
vets are the same. Vets have to really be keyed in on the energy of the animals and really diagnose at a much more intuitive level than like a human doctor would have to do. And what I really loved about your story is it sounded like it took a decade, but it went full circle, which is you cured yourself with the RSI type of modalities that you learned. Then you
Mhm.
did your time as an engineer, but you started exploring all of these other modalities. I love children as well, so I could really see the appeal of helping children. But through the process of figuring out whether or not you wanted to be a child therapist, it brought you full circle. So it didn't seem like there was like one specific event, but there was a lot of different things that kind of allowed you to follow the breadcrumbs until you got back to your somatic roots. And I guess this is only for a few people that know this area, but I happen to live off of Hillsdale Boulevard, so I was only one exit away from you.
Okay, okay,
Pretty
cool.
interesting about that. And
Yeah.
so
Right.
maybe this is a good opportunity just to take a quick break here and just let the audience know like how we met. I believe you're part of the Conscious Asians group as well.
Yes,
Yeah, yeah.
yes.
I specifically was looking for other Asians that had some sort of spiritual awakening to come on the podcast to talk about their story. It was very difficult to find anyone. Then I bumped into you. So I'm super happy to hear about your story. Now, I would say I've probably spoken to 6 different people at this point, and they all had a very specific, like, part of their origin story where they, like, just turned on and woke up, and typically or not typically, these were always in some plant medicine ceremonies. I didn't hear you bring that
Right.
up, the Vipassanas, the silent retreats, things of that nature. Have you had
Yeah,
some
yeah.
plant medicine ceremonies as well mixed into this, or is most of your through meditation and through the modalities that you've been practicing?
Yeah, I haven't really had experience with plant medicine. I've heard positive things about that for sure. And yeah, no, there's a lot of research and more mainstream acceptance that's happening around plant medicine, which I think is really great. But personally, for me, it's been meditation was like the start. And then for many years, I was in the diamond approach, which is like a modern day spiritual path that tries to bring Western psychology with some of the Eastern wisdom traditions.
Mm.
Yeah. And then some of these other modalities. So I've done some like prenatal and birth trauma work in these workshops called like womb surrounds. I've done some of the emotional embodiment work with integral somatic psychology, done a lot of dance, contact improv. Yeah, so those have been more the, like, areas that I've happened to come across in my journey.
That's really cool. The answer to this question didn't really matter to me, but what I really liked about what I heard is that I think a lot of people, myself included, when I was first introduced to plant medicines, it really does seem, or at least the way it was presented to me and the way I hear people talk about it, like this silver bullet of you take this, you're going to have this transcendent experience. And then when you come back, your life is going to be dramatically different. And what I have seen is, for the most part, it is different for maybe a month, 2 months, maybe even 3 months. But after 3 months, they start going back to their old ways. And typically it's
Mm,
because they don't continue to have some sort of practice, meditation, some somatic work, a way to integrate the things that they saw in
sure.
their experiences. And just really wanted to just congratulate you, acknowledge you for all the work that you've put in. And so, what I'm curious about is when your clients come to you, like who is your typical client and what types of challenges do they have?
Yeah. I work with a lot of people of color in their, like, 20s and 30s, and I would say there's a fair amount of, like, anxiety, childhood trauma or wounding, challenges with just the systemic issues of this time, whether it's like climate change or racism or other types of isms that they might be encountering. And yeah, and then sometimes also like depression, that kind of thing.
Got it. Got it. And
Yeah.
I think you brought this up a little bit earlier about how your father's a doctor and you went through the traditional ways of figuring out, do you have some sort of issue that could be solved? And then when you ran out of options, you started looking
Right.
at alternative options. Are your clients in that similar boat, or do they know what a somatic therapist already does?
I see. I see. There's a wide variety. I have some clients that are, like, brand new to therapy, and I think it's so cool that their first therapist is a somatic therapist. And then there are other clients that have done a lot of different therapies, are maybe done with traditional talk therapy and have maybe maxed out on it and see a lot of value of incorporating the body and particularly emotions in the body as a way of facilitating change in therapy. And I would say, like, the clients I see, since I'm in the Bay Area and I have a fair number of younger clients, there's a fair amount of there's a fair amount of openness to non-mainstream ways of thinking. But of course, it varies from person to person.
Yeah, yeah, and I guess maybe the $1,000,000 question here is, when I told my parents I was getting into the cannabis industry, there wasn't a lot of support, so I'm curious on your side when you told your father or your parents that you were gonna take a break, how was that met?
Yeah, I think I'll speak more to my side of the experience. I think my sense is it was difficult for them and, like, surprising. And in fairness to them, I hadn't really included them on this journey. So it was a little bit out of thin air, you could say. So I think understandably they were, like, surprised and maybe concerned. I think a lot of Asian parents have that kind of, like, financial concern, which is, like, super understandable. So that definitely was up for them, and I think there was maybe some hope that I would go back to software because I was taking a break. And my sense is over time, they felt better with it. And even now where, like, obviously being a somatic therapist is very different than being a doctor, but there are similarities in terms of having your own practice, being in this wider umbrella of healthcare. So it has allowed for some connection points between my dad and I, from my perspective.
Yeah. I have been to talk therapy before. I have benefited from talk therapy. I've also seen the limitations of talk therapy where everything seems like a heady concept that you're trying to resolve within the head. Now, when
Sure.
you're
Yeah.
going to a somatic therapist, you talked about like the emotions and the releasing of them. I haven't been to a somatic therapist. I have some idea what it may be like. So, trying to ask for myself as well as the listeners. If you're used to talk therapy and then you go see a somatic therapist, what can you expect to be different?
I think one of the main differences is relaxing a little bit that tendency to need to know why you're experiencing something.
Mm,
I think that's a big transition from talk therapy to somatic therapy. I think in talk therapy can maybe almost even be encouraged if there's some feeling or if there's some desire to know, like, why is that desire there? Where did it come from? What's it about? And those are all super valid and important questions. In talk therapy, the approach is to answer those questions in this top down way, right? Using the mind to answer those questions, which is not just valid, but as you stated, can be very helpful. In somatic therapy, the approach is more of what they call like bottom up processing. So it's more about being with the feelings, the body sensations, the impulses, the energy. And then from deepening into that experience, getting to the bottom in the sense that it's like the bottom of the brain, right? Like our reptilian brain, limbic brain. So it's bottom in that sense, getting to those parts. And then insight can arise, meaning making can be more accurate.
mm,
And so there's really, I think in really good somatic therapy, there's like a lot of slowing down. There's a little bit of letting go of needing to know right away and a bit of, yeah, maybe a bit of patience initially to not have to come up with an answer right away so that something more unknown can be uncovered. Something outside of one's awareness or one's habitual ways of thinking or feeling about an issue can be surfaced.
mm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm just curious. Number one, I'm super happy to be having this conversation with you, but what kind of
Yeah,
motivated you to reach out to me and let me know, hey, I would love to communicate my message on this show?
totally. Yeah. For one, just the name of the podcast fits my own journey, right? Like Silicon Valley to spirituality. And then, yeah, I would say in my own professional journey, I'm at a place where I'm feeling the impulse to start to be more public in terms of different things I've learned and different things I've experienced. I think especially as an Asian man, it feels really important. Just to give one example, in this field of working with, say, chronic pain or mind body medicine, almost all the people that I might be able to refer a client to in terms of online information are white. And that can be difficult just in terms of not feeling a maybe particular sense of relatability or just a certain sense of comfort or just having a different story, a different experience than maybe the typical white person might have. And yeah, it feels important to, as one of the few male of color therapists, to have my own voice and message be broadcast and just for there to be a different resource for people that are curious about these sorts of things, but maybe looking for someone with more of a similar identity.
That totally makes sense. That totally makes sense. I right before this, I was in a panel with a group called the Asian Cannabis Roundtable, and it was so bizarre to see 45 Asians in the cannabis industry all gather together to talk about different ways to partner and help each other. And prior to
Oh,
that,
wow, wow.
yeah, prior to that, I would be the only Asian face when I show up to these Zoom calls and stuff. So I totally can understand why it's so important to have a therapist that you could relate to. Now, you brought up something a little bit earlier that just popped back into my head. I believe it was called Diamond, and you referred to it as like Eastern
Oh,
philosophy
yeah.
mixed with Western psychology. A little bit more because I do feel like we're, at least in my mind, the way I got into spirituality, I don't know how much of my podcast you listen to, but I had this like vision to go study quantum physics. As I studied quantum physics more,
Oh,
I
yeah.
started understanding or started like seeing how things like wave particle duality, quantum entanglement, superposition was talking about these metaphysical concepts in a vocabulary that I think is more digestible for those that might be open to spirituality, but maybe aren't like ready to have faith in something that they can't see, feel, hear, or touch. So, yeah, I was curious. Can you tell me a little bit about Diamond and what they're about?
Yeah. So the diamond approach was founded by this guy called Hamid Ali, also known as H. Almas. That's like his pen name. And yeah, it basically takes a lot of ideas from, say, Western psychology and marries them, I guess you could say, with Buddhist thought, Sufi thought, Hindu thought, and is in its own way is its own path. They have this practice of inquiry, which is really about being with one's experience in the moment and then bringing a curiosity to see how it might unfold. So, the closest example I can think of to describe it is you could describe it as like a talking aloud meditation.
Mm.
So, like, inquiry can be done on one's own, but it's also often done with someone being like a silent, present witness too. And I think yeah, it's actually a good thing to talk about on this show because the creator I think he studied physics at UC Berkeley, if I'm not mistaken. And one thing I always appreciated about him is in these personal growth circles, in these spiritual circles, there's a lot of poetry, there's a lot of like art, there's a lot of this kind of thing. But I know at least this guy, Hamid, he would bring in a mathematical metaphor or a scientific metaphor or physics, stuff like quantum entanglement and all these sorts of things, which I think for my uh, even though I've had this huge career change, there's still this significant part of me that is very like mathematically oriented, science oriented. And so that's always been nice when I'm no longer connected with the diamond approach. But when I was, it was always nice to have that way of speaking be part of the teaching that he had.
Yeah, yeah. I think in my own spiritual journey, each time I found something that was what I perceived to be a game changer for myself, I realized I would tell some people and it wouldn't resonate with them at all.
Mm.
And I started seeing that I like to think about spirituality like the same way I think about mixed martial arts. There could be like so many different combinations of
Right.
striking, grappling, wrestling, and they could be in any different
Yeah.
types of combinations. But if you find like the right ratio for yourself, for your body type, for your personality, you could find
Yes,
a winning
yes.
combination. And
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, so I believe like someone like myself, someone like you, like we both had this affinity for this title of Silicon Valley to spirituality. And I do believe like for someone like myself, I just saw like a Sadhguru or a Shi Hung Yi online. Like I look at them and I'm like, I could never be like that guy. That guy's been at an ashram or he's been meditating at a
Right.
temple. But when I see someone like you, it's like, hey, he used to be a software engineer at Oracle. Now he's doing this. I'm
Yeah.
like, yeah, that's relatable. I might be able to achieve that level at someday.
Totally, totally. Yeah, and that's so fascinating. What that brings up for me is I was looking at this article that I looked at some time ago, and it's by Jack Cornfield, and I think it's called something like Meditation and Psychotherapy or something like that. And it's interesting. I think there's this way with I don't know, like with the meditative approach or like the monastic approach that a lot of the Eastern traditions have passed down and also what we've gotten from them. Like that's like the things people know. They know about the monasteries, they know about meditation. Yeah, I think there can be this idea that the main way to grow is through meditating or you need to go to a cave. And if you can't do that, then it's like this completely hopeless pursuit. So just forget about it and live like this worldly life. So this real split between like worldly life or like spiritual life. And I think part of the problem with that is just meditation or just awareness doesn't really resolve all our issues of suffering. If you're afraid of conflict, then you're not really going to be able to work through that by meditating a lot. In fact, the part of yourself that's afraid of conflict is going to be really happy to meditate because then you can avoid that issue entirely. And so then you're never really free of that particular issue. So I think meditation is super valuable and there's definitely value to looking at our lives and seeing what's really needed here. A lot of us have lives that are like, we have too much stuff or just too many things going on. So there can be a real value to some of the sort of not even renunciating, but even just like a decluttering that can be really helpful and useful. So I think, yeah, the meditation, even some of the like renunciation thinking can be like really valuable. And there needs to be like a confronting with what is it we're really avoiding in our life? What is it where we're still dependent on the external environment, looking a certain way in order to feel satisfied inside? And then I love what I think you've referenced in a lot of your show notes, this idea of following your intuition. Because I think that can really guide us on our journey in a way that if we just get cognitive about it, oh, I just need to meditate or I need to go to a cave, that's not going to capture the magic that our intuition can capture in terms of what we need to do in our lives and what can help us grow in the most transformative way.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting because you were talking about like the monastic life, and I just think about like modern spirituality and the societies that we live in. It's very hard to live a monastic life. And so, a lot of what
Yeah.
I've been thinking about is how do you integrate these spiritual practices so that you could still be a productive human being in the 3D world, but not stress yourself out so much in trying to achieve and do the things that you believe are going to bring you long-term joy, purpose, and fulfillment. And so what I wanted to ask you was, and I think it's quite interesting because as an Asian male myself that has gone, I have my own therapist. I've been to couples therapy with my wife. Is
Yeah.
I had always thought I was at least vis-a-vis other Asian men in touch with my feelings. But when I started doing some somatic work, I realized I have no idea what my feelings are. I'm just good at potentially like talking about them in a way that seems like I'm doing some work or is showing some form of emotional intelligence. So, is there a way that I have quite a few Asian men that listen to this podcast, but is there like a like you could answer certain questions and figure out like your Myers-Briggs or Enneagram. Is there like a similar test for like how
Oh,
in touch are you with your emotions so that
oh,
someone could get
wow.
a baseline? And the reason why I'm asking this is I guess the longer version is I've always been a people pleaser my whole life.
Mm,
And I've
yeah,
talked about this almost ad nauseum with my therapist, like, where is it coming from? And I recently
yeah.
did a hypnosis where in the
Oh,
hypnosis, we were doing a past life regression. And in the
yeah,
past life regression, something came up where I was abandoned and another family adopted me. And as I was speaking to the practitioner that helped me, she's very in tune energetically. And she was saying this wasn't just this life or the past life, it was also this life. And I went and talked to my mom about it, and she had told me that they actually my mom, my father, and my 2 siblings immigrated to America about 9 months before I did, and I came around my first birthday. And in my mind, I'm thinking, "Oh, wait, I'm a child. What do I remember?" But I started really going, "Wow, I think my body remembered being abandoned, and this is why I
yeah,
people please
yeah.
all the time because I'm very worried about being abandoned." And that was like just this
Oh,
such a eye-opening, "Oh, this is where it's coming from." Like abandonment. So
yeah,
I was just curious
yeah,
now that you've
yeah,
heard my full story, anything come up for you or any suggestions about how other people could potentially get a better idea of
yeah.
how in tune they are with their body and their
Mm.
emotions?
Yeah. I don't know if there's like a good quiz, but I think one thing that, so personally, I've really benefited from this approach, integral somatic psychology, which is probably better known as the practice of embodying emotions. And it's cool because it's created by an Indian male. So that might be part of the reason I happen to resonate with it or why it's been so effective for me. And so I've seen in the last couple of years a significant shift in terms of my own emotional and body awareness. And one thing I can do now that maybe a couple years ago I couldn't, that maybe is like a good question one could ask oneself is I will know more specifically why I am like stressed or overwhelmed or why my nervous system is dysregulated. Because we have all these ways of saying basically we're not doing so great. Some people might say, I'm stressed out. Some people might say, I don't feel good. Some people might say, my nervous system is dysregulated. Whatever the thing might be. If you can more specifically say what it was that happened and what it was you were feeling that was too much, that caused you to be stressed, then that's a good indication of like emotional and somatic awareness. Yeah. So, for example, to be like super transparent, right? This is probably like the first podcast I'm doing, right? So, today I noticed like almost like a little bit of what one might call dissociation in my body, not quite fully connected,
Mm.
and a little bit of like an ick feeling like, oh, am I worthy enough to like be on a podcast? Is my story worthy enough to share? All these very, I think, common human doubts, questions, this type of thing. Whereas I think like a few years ago in a similar situation, I would just notice feeling like, I don't know, stressed or something like that. Something more generic than like a specific situation, specific emotion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Really cool. You brought up intuition earlier,
Mhm.
and I'm just curious, what do you think intuition is?
Oh. Huh. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, hmm. There are a lot of different ways to answer that. It's interesting. One thought that comes is intuition is often a quiet voice or one of the quieter voices and can often only arise when the noisier voices have been given a chance to settle down. There's an answer that's maybe gets into more of a metaphysical place.
Yeah, I want to hear that one.
Um, yeah, which I don't even know how to word, but it's almost in somewhat to somatics, like that we have different ways of knowing than just the cognitive. Like in your example, there's this way your body knows about this first year of your life, the fear of abandonment. I think sometimes our intuition comes from this body knowing that maybe comes from just other ways we've gathered information. And then, yeah, it's always hard to talk about the more metaphysical answers, but I guess intuition is this thinking about how to even define intuition, but I guess it's like a type of knowing that is like different than the traditional cognitive way of knowing.
Yeah.
And it's tricky because what are different people calling intuition? I could imagine some people listening to this be like, oh, someone's gonna do something bad and justify it by that was my intuition. There are a lot of ways it can be like perverted or misunderstood. Yeah, I don't know. Like that's what I got right now. I'm curious. Yeah, what that
Yeah.
curious your own.
More on the practical Newtonian physics level, I would say intuition is your body's like somatic communication to you, meaning that your conscious brain, the part of you that hears like the words in your head, is Seibo saying something smart or stupid. I think of that as like the conscious brain doing its pros and cons list. Should I leave Oracle? Should
Yeah.
I stay in Oracle? Whereas
Right.
like your intuition will just give you this feeling like, hey, it's time to start exploring
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
else. And to your point, I believe you're absolutely right, which is this is why meditation has become more popular is that as you start quieting the louder voices of the conscious brain, you're able to access more of that subconscious information. And I don't know how they came up with these numbers, but I cite these numbers quite a bit. They say that the conscious
Mm,
brain could process 40 bits of data per second. Your subconscious could
mm.
process 20 million bits of data per second.
Wow.
When I read that, I was like, wow. And then it said your conscious brain communicates to you in words, your subconscious communicates to you in feelings. And so I quickly
Mm,
started connecting that feelings are actually a heuristic for logical and rational thinking. But in today's society, we often have a intuition to do something, but we utilize our logical, rational minds to sometimes talk us into it, most of the times talk ourselves out of it. Hey, you went to MIT, you're at Oracle, you're on the fast track to become
right.
a director, a VP, and stay in that. And then on a metaphysical level, what I was shown in one of my meditations is that intuition is the breadcrumbs from your higher self or your spirit guides or your guardian angels that are like at the like sitting on a cloud while you're in the valley of a maze, and they're not going
Mm,
to tell you um it's time for you to quit your job and to become a somatic therapist, but they will get you excited or curious about like
mm,
going to a Vipassana or different things that could start leading you to a
yeah.
path. And so that's what was shown to me as what intuition is. And as I saw these in my meditations, I started trying to implement that into my life where I'm a very rational, logical person. So anytime I purchase something, it's Amazon reviews, CNET reviews, whatever, really trying to justify my purchase.
Yeah,
And then over since
yeah,
COVID started, really tried to just go off of, "Hey, how do I like this Sony mirrorless camera or this Nikon?
yeah,
I
where do
I
you
I I resonate with the
yeah,
Sony. Let's just get this one," and start seeing if
yeah.
my intuitive decisions would pay off.
Mm,
And then to your point, sometimes it had led to a outcome that wasn't my preferred outcome, but what I have seen that with given enough time, these non-preferred outcomes were actually like the pit stops where you learn a few things that are going to you're gonna benefit
right.
from further down the road.
No, I really appreciate that. that way of describing intuition. And actually, I think it ties into your question before of like, how is somatic therapy different than talk therapy? And not that this fully encapsulates it, but there's a similarity here in terms of for both therapist and client in a somatic therapy session, there is this following of intuition.
How cool.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah. Dropping like letting the louder, noisier, faster thoughts settle and paying attention to the body and feelings and the quieter thoughts
Yeah.
and the intuition that comes through.
Yeah. Little visual just popped into my head as you were saying that is that like I also read that we have roughly 70,000 thoughts per day. 90% of what we think about today is the same as yesterday. And about
Right, right.
70% of our aggregate thoughts tend to be negative thoughts. And so the analogy that I just saw in my head was that if you picture your brain as like a freeway and
Mm,
your thoughts are cars, then every day there's a bunch of anxious cars, stressed out cars, self-loathing cars that keep getting on the freeway, and then when there's 40 cars on the freeway, you hit a traffic jam because that's about as much data as like the or many cars as your freeway will allow before it starts jamming up. And then when you meditate, it's like allowing like the on-ramp of like stressful cars to slow down so that as it
mm.
slows down, the epiphany cars or the insightful cars or the intuitive cars could start coming up. And I love that to me, what you're doing, especially as an Asian male, is super important because as I've gotten older, I've realized that I was always very intuitive, but I would just keep asking
Right.
people to validate my intuition.
Yes,
And
yes.
I would keep asking until I found someone that I respected that was like, Seibo,
Right,
that's okay. And then that would give me
right,
permission to
right.
follow my own intuition.
Right. That mirrors my own journey so much, like whether it was leaving Oracle, what grad school to go to, what therapy internships to go to. I would have some intuition or sometimes in diamond approach, and I think other modalities, they sometimes call it like inner guidance, which maybe speaks to like the metaphysical way of holding intuition. But I would have this inner guidance, but then I would notice myself similarly, like asking so many different people, what do you think about this? What do you think about this? What do you think about this? And yeah, over time, that's definitely that whole process for me has shortened as I've learned to trust my intuition more and also be okay with the fear or the uncertainty that sometimes comes from following intuition because we may not have as much might not have as much rational knowing that things will work out the way we think we want them to. And so that can understandably bring up anxiety, fear, concern, worry, unsureness. And sometimes it's like our inability to be with those kinds of feelings that makes it hard to rely on intuition.
Yeah. Oh man, exactly. I always want to be conscious of the time, but maybe we could go a little bit longer on this episode. I want you to elaborate on what you just talked about, the difficulty of following your intuition because we tend to be prone to wanting a predictable result given the effort that we put into something. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what you were talking about? Because I think that's a very important area of discussion of people that want to follow their intuition, but then, like me, it's like, hey, I
Yeah.
want to follow it, but I have this fear that if I follow this, my life is going to be a catastrophe. So I need someone that I respect to give me permission to follow my intuition.
Yeah. Yeah. I think first, just as we've alluded to, it's so normal, right? Because just to normalize that we, as individuals, we care about ourselves. We want ourselves to be safe and healthy and have an enjoyable life experience. And the way, at least in modern society, we've been taught to do that is to, in this kind of linear way, know that, okay, if I do X, then Y is going to happen. If I do A, B is going to happen. And to have it laid out where we know what's going to happen. Yeah, I think it can be scary to follow our intuition, to have to let go a little bit of knowing exactly where things are going, and to confront that very universal, I think universal kind of human fragility that we are these creatures that in some ways in modern society we're very safe, but we also have this knowing that anything can happen at any moment. And especially nowadays with how chaotic the world is, that feels even more true with whether it's financial stress or political stress or whatever it might be. Uh, so I think yeah, I think it's very understandable. And I think there's such beauty in the process of slowly beginning to follow one's intuition and getting these counter experiences. And and then over time, I think it becomes easier to be with the fear. It becomes easier to follow one's intuition, easier to be with not knowing. And as I think about my own journey, I think there's something to be said that for some people, this may not be everyone's journey, that sometimes it can go in small little steps. Maybe back in 2011, there was some intuition to quit my job, but I wasn't ready to do that yet, just in terms of an inner strength or inner capacity. Yeah, I think the good news is that it's okay if we mess up. It's okay if we don't get it right all the time. I think life provides a lot of opportunities for course corrections. And like you alluded to, sometimes the thing we think is, and so that's definitely something, I guess you could say a spiritual view I have on life, that no matter what the situation, I want to try to embrace it as much as I can and use it for my own growth and learning so that I can be better for myself and better for others going forward.
Yeah, I love that ideology because as I thought about that ideology, it works both on a metaphysical level and it also works on a tactical and practical level, which is if you can just view that these things happening to you are not just happening for your suffering, but are happening or that they are the catalyst for you to learn and grow and figure more of yourself or learn more about yourself, then I believe it's a much easier way to navigate this polarizing and challenging time that we have the opportunity to live through right now. And I like to think of it as an
Yeah.
opportunity to live through because at the beginning of the
Yeah. Yeah.
pandemic, I thought, wow, this is like the worst thing possible. But I've seen so many people who have utilized, this, whether they were pro-vax, anti-vax, pro-mask, anti-mask, they found something that catalyzed them
Right.
to ask more questions, to explore different areas. And
Yeah.
what I really wanted to ask you is that for myself, I realized that I was super disconnected from my body because I noticed that about every 2 years, I would get so sick where I needed to more or less be bedridden for 2 weeks at a time. And after the 3rd cycle, I was like, "You know what? I'm just not picking." I had no idea I was exhausted. I had no idea I was burnt out. So for the people listening, are there any, like, markers that the people listening can maybe pick up
Mm.
on to go, "Hey, I might be ignoring my body. It might be a good time to contact a Jay about how to have a more stronger, consistent connection with my body?"
Yeah, totally. I think before I answer that, I want to circle back just to the pandemic piece because I think there's just a piece I wanted to speak to that. I think this is where it's interesting. I think a lot of spiritual conversation can get tricky because I could imagine someone hearing what we just talked about and then being like, COVID was terrible for me. Maybe I lost a loved one or so many people died or whatever. And so just to put in the caveat, it's not to deny the depths of suffering that happened from the pandemic or the heartache that people suffered from it. So it's to 100% acknowledge that. And at the same time, to also acknowledge that, almost to use like a metaphor, if I like to think of life as the almost like raw ingredients of food, and then how I relate to life is what I get to actually eat. Like what I do with those raw ingredients of food, I can then make into some meal or whatever. And so whatever happens, I don't want to be like complaining about the ingredients that have been presented to me because there are no other ingredients I can get. Life is as it is. There are all these forces in the universe, whether it's metaphysical or scientific, that have made life the way it is in this moment, and to try to engage with it in the best way possible,
Mm,
while also acknowledging the suffering that has happened historically and was still happening now.
yeah.
So I just wanted to give that context.
Yeah, thank you for adding
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
I think it's important for people to hear that because I'm definitely not advocating like this was a great thing that happened. And to me, this is one of the great examples of why being able to hold paradoxes or being able to hold multiple truths in your
yes,
head at
yeah,
the same time is so important is that you could acknowledge that, yeah, a lot of
yeah,
people died, a lot of really horrible things happened. And hey, we got some ingredients here and we still have to make something that tastes good.
yeah, yeah, totally, totally, yeah. Yeah, and we don't know what the ripple effects will be. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, but to go back to the question you answered, what would someone maybe look for in terms of indicators that something might be off with their mental emotional health? So I think it's interesting. I think there are actually two broad categories as I think about it. Sometimes people just know, right? And there's also I think there are a lot of ways that things can get somaticized or physicalized in our society. So I think having trouble getting up when you want to get up is a good indicator that maybe something emotionally is going on. Of course, there could be a medical issue. And I think in the vast majority of cases, it's often there's some difficult emotional situation that is causing people to have stretches where they can't get out of bed when they want to get out of bed. I think what we consume can also be a really good indicator. If one is, for example, not wanting to get sucked into YouTube, but that keeps happening, then that's a good sign that there's something internal to work on. And then also how one's relationships are going. If one is feeling, I like some of the framework you would given a feeling like joy, satisfaction, purpose. If these things don't feel at least somewhat available in one's life, then potentially something like somatic therapy or meditation or some other type of growth work can be really useful. And from my perspective, it's like a lifelong thing because there's just so much joy and growth and expansion. It just depends on what one is needing in the moment and also what resources one has available, because that's a reality in our current society as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much for that. And for people that are listening that are interested in working with you, how do they get a hold of you? What's the best place or places?
Sure. I have a website. It's called neckdowntherapy.com. And yeah, pretty much has all my information and how to reach out for me. And yeah, even if currently I'm only licensed to work with people in California, but with some of what I've talked about sounds appealing and you're looking for maybe some resources for where you live, then definitely feel free to reach out.
Down therapy. That's so cool. And before I let you go, this is the open-ended question that I ask everyone is what is top of mind for you that you want to communicate and express to the audience? So really open-ended question. Usually I don't tell people I'm going to ask this so that they can just use their intuition or get into flow state and let
Right,
the
right,
most
right.
heart-centric answer come out.
Yeah. I think I'm gonna go with top of heart. What's on top of heart is just that there is so much I think there are a lot of ways we've been told life has to be, and there are ways life is difficult and challenging, absolutely. And I think most people don't realize how much growth, how much expansion, how much joy is really possible. And so I would really encourage people not to think that whatever, if they're in a place of suffering, that whatever place of suffering they're in is permanent or is never going to change or this is just who I am, but rather to be open to the possibility of change, to keep looking, to keep trying things, to keep having conversations, to keep investing in oneself, and really doing the best we can while we have this limited time here on this planet. Yeah.
Yeah, that resonates with me a lot. I am someone that believed that the only way to a purpose-driven life was to suffer and suffer as much as I can, and then show the world like this is what I've created through my suffering. But I've now come to realize that you don't need to. And life could be joyful, it could be happy. It doesn't need to be filled with constantly being on the hamster wheel to be productive or to achieve something. And then the flip side
Yeah.
was also just to be really kind to myself, give myself space to grow and evolve into the person that I will continually be evolving. And I really love that you said it wasn't just like something that you do like for 2 or 3 months with you and you're good. It's actually a lifelong pursuit, and I believe that if we all look at it as a lifelong pursuit of looking for joy and happiness and thinking about our physical existence under this framework, then we all have a much
Yeah.
greater ability to, maybe in metaphysical terms, get into the 5D and start living with more joy and happiness versus living with a lot of anxiety and stress.
Yeah, well said, said. I appreciate that.
All right, Ajay. Thank you so much for being on my podcast. It's neck down under, or sorry, under the neck or below the
Neckdowntherapy.com.
okay, neckdowntherapy.com. All right, everyone. In the show notes, I will create the link so you guys don't need to hear me butcher it. Neckdowntherapy.com. Ajay, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really enjoyed this conversation. I loved hearing about your story. And this isn't specifically for Asian men, but what I do know of Asian men is literally, I don't know if I've ever met one that had been connected somatically to their body without doing work. So if you're listening to this and you're an Asian man, most likely you are disconnected. Give this man a call. Just get a consultation, see where it's going, and you will see, just like me, it's like having a brand new life where you are able to experience more, express more, give more love, receive more love. And to me, that's only a good thing. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.